Well, the question I'd like to put to you today is, are you paying too much attention to your sun sign and not enough attention to your rising sign? And I'd like to put before you now some reasons as to why you should actually prefer to listen to your rising sign rather than your sun sign. Now, you and all of us are spirit in flesh. The flesh is the universe. It's not in the universe, it literally is the universe. And the universe obviously is alive because you're completely proof of that. But let's bring it back to the rising sign and the ascendant. When you were born, you were still attached by an umbilical cord to your mother. That was cut and you drew your first breath. And the moment that you drew your first breath is the moment of great importance. That is the ascendant. And to find the ascendant, you have to look to see what was the star sign that was rising above the eastern horizon at the time of your birth. Now, when you drew your first breath, you really then did have the first independent interaction between you as flesh and you as spirit. And the time that you did that is special. It corresponds to a degree. Now, there's a rising sign, that is, there was a star sign which was rising above the eastern horizon at the time of your birth. And I'm going to use this hand-drawn thing because it makes it easy for you to see. And what we'll do we'll use, because traditionally in instructional things to do with astrology, they start with Cancer. So there's the sign of Cancer. Notice this, there are no planets in Cancer. There are planets in other houses around here, but nothing in there. But your ascendant is, we'll call it here, 17 degrees. Now, here there is the ascendant at 17 degrees. Well, we don't pay any attention to that. We just say that Cancer is the first house. And there it is, the first house. Now, what is the first house to do with? The first house, of course, is that of the ascendant. And it usually lasts, the star sign that is going above the eastern horizon usually takes about 2 hours, but it can take a lot less depending on how far away from the equator you are and which sign it is that is the rising sign. It can take anywhere from about 3/4 of an hour to somewhere like 3.5 hours, but the usual average is something in the order of about 2 hours. That's what it takes. Now, the first house is very personal, and it sets, of course, the rest of the houses. The first house has its own ruler. Now, in this case, because it is Cancer, the ruler of the house will be, although I haven't noted it here, the ruler of the house will be the moon, because the moon is the ruler of Cancer. But there's also something more interesting happening here as well. And you notice that I've put this sigil for Mercury out there. There are in astrology, and you may or may not have heard of it, things that are called the joys. And it's the 7 classical planets, that is the Sun, out to and including Saturn. Where, in which house do they find their joy? Where do they rejoice and say, this is fantastic, I'm going to do really well? Well, what happens here is that the first house joy is that of Mercury. Now, isn't that interesting? Because Mercury is the go-between, and Mercury is the one that moves between spirit and matter, bringing messages, doing that. So what the first house is actually talking about, it is the animation of spirit engaging with the material configuration of the human, or what other particular form of matter it might be. And so the first house is very spiritual. It sets your spirituality. You get an imprint, if you like. That's when the ignition is turned on. When you take that breath, the spirituality is ignited, the psychological predispositions are ignited, and the physical predispositions and look are excited. The other thing to bear in mind is, and I'll just mention these other joys just because they're on the board here. Now, incidentally, because we have the ascendant here in Cancer at 17 degrees, the opposite will be the case over here where the descendant will be. Now, the sun is also important. The sun is important, for example, in this case, I'll get rid of these planets. The sun will be important where it is above the descendant. And so what you have is what they call a day chart. And that's where you often have many planets which are above the line of the descendant. So the sun is important there, and the moon is important in night charts. That is where it is below, say, 17 degrees. So it's going to come across to about here. So this is where the descendant line will be. That's where the setting sun is, and this is where night falls, where those other planets were. That actually it was a night chart that we could look at there. Now, the other things that are interesting in here, that Goddess is seen as being in house 3. Good fortune is being seen as being in Venus in house number 5. Bad fortune, Mars, in house number 6. I've got a lot of planets in my house, number 6, bad fortune, but I've got Mars in there as well, and Mars says, bad fortune! I am bad fortune. We'll take care of all of this. God is seen as being in number 9. Good spirit is Jupiter in house 11 and bad spirit in house number 12. The only other thing that I'll say in finishing is this, is that when you think about it, the sun is in your sign for the sun is around in a sign for about 30 days in a month. I know there are 31, but in some months, but about 30 days. The moon is in the sign for about 2.5 days, or 48 hours. 730 hours for the month in the sun, 48 hours for the moon in the sign. And the rising sign, if you take it at 2 hours, is about 0.27% of the time that the sun is in the sign. And if you take the ascendant, it is just the moment of your first breath. So you might find that really you should, because the first house is so personal, it is where the ascendant is, it is where the rising sign are, it's where heaven and matter engage together, that really, after all, you should be looking at the rising sign. I'll see you next time.